My apologies. Sorry for that.
Yep.
Dan, yes, we are going to record this so that people can listen to it archived later on our website. Before you continue, Dan, I'm sorry to interrupt again. If you have not yet seen Dan's interview of former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani on Voice of Israel and on our Facebook, please go take a look at it. It was just on last week and it was fantastic. I apologize.
Thank you.
Yeah, now we continue with the call, and I will not interrupt again.
Well, thank you for that little announcement, that little plug. That's very kind. The truth of the matter is, it was a thrill. It was a thrill conversing on camera with former Mayor Giuliani, and he made a very eloquent plea on behalf of the necessity of Prime Minister Netanyahu to accept the invitation of Speaker Boehner and come to the Congress. And he used the words, he must accept the invitation. So I would urge everyone to listen to the former mayor, former presidential candidate Giuliani, and he does make quite an eloquent plea. And it's in that context that I wanted to reiterate the level of trepidation over the current situation with the United States, opposite Iran, opposite ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hamas and Hezbollah, and all of the other radical Islamic elements in the region. When the two major issues with regard to the current crisis of the United States that have always been imprinted in all of our minds here, those of us analysts in the political class and leadership, is the notion of Israel being a bipartisan, enjoying bipartisan support. And everyone that's dealt with foreign policy here, and from the leadership, political class, academics, policy institute people, everyone is from the center left, the center, and the center right, and the right understands the extreme importance of the bipartisanship of United States support, and have really done everything, I think, on a diplomatic level to maintain the sense that Democrats and Republicans both privately and publicly in statements and in relationship everyone here deeply appreciates that bipartisan support. And the other issue that was an issue of between us and the United States of international consensus is the notion of sanctions against Iran. And those two elements right now, the bipartisanship and the sanctions against Iran, are both in danger. And so the question becomes one of hard decision-making. Does the Prime Minister stick to his guns and go to Washington, speak before another joint session of Congress? By the way, he did this in 2011, and it was the same Speaker, John Boehner, who invited him, and it was the same President of the United States, Barack Obama, who did not have a comment at that time, and the speech went ahead as scheduled. And here, clearly the political circumstances have changed, but many things and the dangers have increased as well. And when we look at the one side of the moral divide and the risks of giving the speech, one has to admit that there are all sorts of political risks. There's the risk of intensifying the crisis with the Obama White House. There's which might result in foreign aid cutoff and financial penalties. A possible weapons supply cutoff. Israel already experienced the withholding of weapons this past summer during the war with Hamas, when the United States withheld Hellfire missiles and not allowing Israel to do a drawdown from existing inventory levels of American depots here in Israel. So that's a real risk. There's a risk that we would invite increased pressure to concede on the Palestinian issue, the White House being even further annoyed than they are today. There is a risk of support, actually, for BDS and delegitimization of Israel, as John Kerry indicated and warned at the Aspen Institute some months ago. There's a risk of driving a further partisan wedge into the Israeli-U.S. relationship, which is obviously something that's been in the headlines across the seas, across the Atlantic, as well as in Israel. This notion of the perception of a partisan politics, whether or not that's true at all, and it is, and I can say with a resounding no that it is not true from Israel's point of view, and I'll tell you in a couple minutes why, and the people with whom I've spoken very close to the Prime Minister, who, without mentioning names, but clearly who have made that point. But there is more political risk if the Prime Minister were to go ahead. There's the risk of further eroding democratic support for Israel at a time when bipartisan support, especially with regard to supporting Israel's stance on the risk of nuclearizing Iran, are so great. There's a risk of alienating large segments of the American Jewish establishment. People on this call perhaps notwithstanding. And clearly we've heard very disturbing, I think, indications from a number of Jewish organizations who have implored the Prime Minister to cease and desist from giving this speech and coming to Washington to a session of the Joint Houses of Congress. And there's a risk of being blamed, for Israel to be blamed as the culprit if the United States ends up taking military action ultimately against the Islamic Republic of Iran. So all of these are reasons for trepidation, but as you know, on the other hand, there are risks of conceding to the Obama White House and staying home and not giving the speech. And the major risk here, ladies and gentlemen, is that Israel faces, as many of you, if not all of you know, a mortal threat from the Iranian regime, and that it is believed not only by the Prime Minister but by many around him and ministers around him and the security echelons, that this existential danger would come to fruition if this deal were to be signed. It would leave in the hands of the Iranian regime thousands of centrifuges that would be spinning, and within a matter of weeks, if not months, it would allow Iran to become a nuclear threshold state. And that means one of two things. It means either the current levels of 3.5% uranium enrichment or 20% uranium enrichment, depending on which stockpile you're looking at, could easily reach the 90% military-grade uranium enrichment threshold, and from there, the move to a nuclear weapon is very, very short. The distance between the military-grade uranium at 90% enrichment and nuclear and putting it on a ballistic missile is very short. The second understanding of breakout would mean moving from a weapons grade, only from weapons grade, to weaponization of using that enrichment to weaponize that enriched uranium and reaching a nuclear weapon. And these are very clearly very, very serious and existential issues for Israel. And I can say authoritatively, after having done some homework before this call so I could bring you, Adam Fishman wrote, this is an insider briefing. So I wanted to bring you some insider information. Besides just giving you, some thoughts, some assessment about it, because everyone can give assessment, but what I wanted to do is to try to get you some insider information. And that information is, I spoke with two people, one who's a senior security official and very close to the Prime Minister's office, and the other an official of the Israeli government very close to the Prime Minister's office and as an advisor, a close advisor, and both said, from their vantage point, this is absolutely not an issue of elections. This issue has been so politicized, and I must say the Obama White House has done an excellent job in manufacturing a major crisis here. Let's just remind ourselves, as many of us on this call have done probably several times, is that Speaker Boehner is the third most important U.S. official in the U.S. government system, and when Speaker Boehner invites a foreign leader to speak to Congress, one is very, very hard put not to accept that invitation, even notwithstanding the fact that he represents obviously the opposition in the House, the Senate, but notwithstanding that, Netanyahu accepted that invitation. And at the end of the day, this is a speech. This is not diplomatic treason. This is a speech. It is a plea from the two people that I spoke to. I can say clearly to you, this is a plea that it is 5 minutes to midnight. It is 5 minutes to midnight, and this is a plea in order to stop this deal from going through. It is not an attempt to reinstate sanctions per se. This is an attempt to end this deal, to influence the American people through their elected representatives to stop this deal from going through. Because the Prime Minister feels, and others in the security echelons feel, this deal is so dangerous for Israel, it would most likely force Israel to take military action at some point, because the ability of Iran to manufacture the uranium enrichment cycle would be so short, and the weaponization process so quick, that it was quite likely that intelligence agencies would miss the breakout period, as they have in the past, over the last, over the last 20 years of Iranian nuclear development, and it would simply be too late. And if we think it's bad now in the Middle East with, Iran's proxy Hezbollah in the north and its semi-proxy Hamas in our south, and the fact that Iran now controls 4 Middle Eastern states besides itself, meaning Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and now in parts of Sudan, well, it's going to get a whole lot worse if there's nuclear military power behind the level of terrorism that Iran supports across the Middle East, and by the way, deep into Latin America as well. So this is, from Israel's point of view, this is really a last-minute plea to the American people and to the world in order to listen to Israel's case and understand the facts of the case. Let's be very clear. Prime Minister Netanyahu has intelligence that no one on this call, and first and foremost, the person who's speaking now included, has. We don't have the intelligence the Prime Minister has. He has, arguably, I would assess, the best intelligence in the world on the Iranian nuclear program. And that intelligence is motivating him, is deploying and mobilizing him in order to make this last-minute plea. And it is, those who say that Netanyahu is merely benefiting because it's election time, I mean, goodness gracious, this is a 3-time prime minister who already has had a difficult relationship with this administration. The last thing that he wants to do is to so irritate President Barack Obama as to cause a full-blown crisis with the administration. At the same time, there are moments in the national life of the Jewish people that it is time to get up and say our piece in order to prevent to the type of catastrophe that God forbid we experienced a half a decade and more ago, last century. And clearly, in terms of the current crisis with the administration, there is good historical precedent. This is not a sui generis crisis with our greatest ally. Many of us remember what happened in 1975 when Yitzhak Rabin had a crisis that was perhaps less covered because media was far less penetrating and broad and democratic as an exposure tool. But clearly, many of us remember what happened between Yitzhak Rabin and Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford back in 1975, when Kissinger was engaging in shuttle diplomacy between Egypt and Israel, trying to get a deal done between the two. And the Egyptians, as many of us remember, were dead set on limiting their flexibility to what they called non-belligerency, and Israel was forced to accept concessions, was forced to make concessions on certain oil fields in the Sinai, as well as conceding certain strategic mountain passes. And there was actually a letter that was penned by the offices of Henry Kissinger, put into the hands of Gerald Ford, and sent to Rabin, expressing profound disappointment at Israel's position because Rabin didn't want to budge, and that began to create a crisis, a full-blown crisis between the United States and Israel. As a matter of fact, it was discovered by Rabin that Kissinger had put Ford up to this, according to historical assessments, that it was recaptured very beautifully as recently as yesterday in the Allgemeiner by Dr. Raphael Medoff, the well-known historian. And in fact, this became a full-blown crisis, and Rabin brought it to Congress. He won there were 2 congressional resolutions. He won both of them with a Democratic majority, but at the same time, the pressure and the sense of isolation that Rabin felt from the administration was so great, Rabin ended up conceding his position and accepting the Egyptian position of non-belligerency. So there is one very strong historical precedent in the last 40 years for this type of crisis with the United States, and Israel got through it. And the other crisis, of course, was the crisis over the Osirak, the destruction of Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor by the Israeli Air Force in June 1981. It was a major crisis between the Reagan administration and the state of Israel, and there were all sorts of far-reaching financial and other weapons supply punishments that were to be meted out by the administration. And as a matter of fact, as it is recounted by Ambassador Avner, who wrote a book called The Prime Ministers, that I urge everyone on this call to read if you haven't read it yet. It's an extraordinary recollection by one of the speechwriters of four Israeli prime ministers, including Begin. Yehuda Avner recounts that immediately after Begin had received word that the strike had happened against the Ashwiak reactor, he called Ambassador Sam Lewis in Tel Aviv in order to report what had happened. The Americans had been kept in the dark, and Ambassador Lewis said to Begin that there's going to be a whole lot of anger in the White House about the destruction, the Israeli destruction of the reactor. And Ambassador Lewis said, "Bear in mind, Prime Minister Begin, your weaponry was procured from us under the Arms Export Act for purposes of self-defense." And to which Begin retorted, "Self-defense? What greater act of self-defense could there be than to demolish Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction?" And the second thing that Ambassador Sam Lewis complained about was that Begin acted without informing the United States. Well, here you have a situation, on the one hand, that's quite similar, because it's not Iraq that is procuring nuclear weapons. It's Iran, its neighbor, attempting to procure nuclear weapons and openly threatening, as Iraq did, to destroy the Jewish state. The only difference here is that Netanyahu is taking a more moderate route and trying to solve this existential problem for Israel through diplomacy. And he is being dragged through the mud by the American administration because of accusations, one of breaking protocol, which we know because of the New York Times correction just the other day is absolutely untrue. That in fact the administration knew about this invitation and that Israel accepted this invitation before Prime Minister Netanyahu accepted the invitation. So that is one thing that is untrue. The second point I want to make about Israeli concessions, if Israel were to back down, the Prime Minister were to concede to the administration and not accept the invitation of Speaker Boehner to address Congress, is that Israel, under this opposite this American administration, has not gained anything but derision for making concessions, which began in May 2009 when the president demanded from Israel to accept the Palestinian state and cease and desist from all settlement building, including any kind of building in Jerusalem. Well, in fact, Israel actually, as you remember, Prime Minister Netanyahu conceded at that time to President Obama, gave the well-known Bar Ilan speech in which he accepted the notion of two states for two peoples against his own public history. And really belief system and that of his party, and he also mobilized a freeze of almost 1 year. He freed scores of terrorists in order to restart the most recent set of talks, and Israel did not gain anything from those concessions other than further pressures from the United States. So there has not been a good track record of concessions leading to the gaining of the respect of the administration, as Brett Stevens points out in a very well crafted piece in the Wall Street Journal, which I'm sure many of you read, which read the headline of which is why Netanyahu's speech must be given in Congress. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, one thing to remember is that sometimes, if we don't take the opportunity to speak out to the world and try to create a dynamic through giving this speech in Congress, a dynamic can be created that can begin to affect and persuade the minds and the hearts and minds of the American people and their elected representatives. There are many that say that it will not have influence, it will not have practical influence, and will not change the decision-making process because there's such a media and political circus around the main issue of Iran that people will not pay attention to the issue of Iran. But there are those of us who think differently, who assess that Netanyahu's rhetorical skills and his knowledge, his expertise are so great that he may well be able to generate a new momentum and really get people to start thinking about the facts of the case, and then, in fact, I think that finally we should really thank one great American Jewish leader, Mort Klein of the ZOA, who has been very firm and unrelenting in his support of Israel. And I think what Mort Klein is reminding all of us is there are times when we just have to stand up for principle and stand unconditionally with the state of Israel, even when it's uncomfortable, even when there are a lot of risks attached, and there are a lot of risks. There's a tremendous amount of discomfort over the current situation with the administration, and it's not easy, and it's even extremely uncomfortable. But I think that what Mort Klein is reminding us is that there are times that all the time we have to stand unconditionally with Israel and really accept the Prime Minister's assessment that there is a mortal danger to the state of Israel that has to be put on the table, that has to be put out on the public agenda. And the best place the Prime Minister is determined to do it at this juncture to stop the deal from going through, if it's possible, is in front of Congress as he did in 2011. Mort Klein actually brings up the example, which I think is a strong example, but perhaps under completely different circumstances. Back in the 1930s, when two men, one was actually Ben Hecht and Peter Bergson, who was Hillel Kook, the son of Rav Kook, and the Bergson group, who were trying to publicize and stop the Nazi massacres of European Jewry. They were demonized by certain fellow Jews in the United States and not allowed prevented from making their case in front of Congress, and they were delegitimized in front of Congress. And the point being, we should say lahavdil. I mean, there are many, many differences today. I think there's greater unity among the Jewish people than there was at that time, certainly with respect to Israel. But we have to really bear in mind that now it's time for all of us to stand shoulder to shoulder and in complete unity around Israel. If we want to help Israel, we need to support the Prime Minister and his assessment of the mortal danger that Israel would be in if this agreement were to go through. And American Friends of the Likud and the all over the world have an extremely important role to play here in trying to foster support, unconditional support, in the name of the unity of the Jewish people, especially now at this particular time, and to end the partisanship within the Jewish community, and to create an iron wall of support for Israel. It's just simply a critical time. I don't remember a time so critical because of the current crisis with the United States. Now, having said that, it's clear that the United States, the American people are with Israel, and Israel will continue, in my assessment, to be a strong bipartisan issue. However, the rumblings right now have to be faced by a real wall-to-wall consensus within the Jewish community, as much as can be garnered right now. And you folks and all of us together play a very important role in trying to foster that unity and stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel in a totally unconditional way at this critical moment of crisis. So with that, I'll stop. That'll be just my opening 15 minutes or so. I'd be more than happy to address your comments or questions.
Dan, thank you. And as usual, I'll go first. I guess it's not surprising to anybody on this call that J Street or Jeffrey Goldberg would come out strongly and recommend that Bibi stay home. But I was surprised the other day that commentary did also. So my question to you is, you probably know that all of us on this phone call, or most of us certainly, agree with your position, but is there any indication that Bibi is wavering? And if he didn't show up, what do we get for it? Would it make the Iranian agreement any more palatable to us? Probably not. But why would he not show up, given an existential threat on the other hand, and very bad press, or a damaged relationship on the other?
Well, there are some people that say that he could, the greatest PR for his upcoming scheduled APAC appearance is what has happened here in this current critical environment, and that the tremendous press coverage over this spat, which has become more than a spat between the administration and the Netanyahu coalition, or Netanyahu really himself, has generated all of the promo that he would need in order to reach every single member of Congress via television, because everyone's going to be would be watching the talk. But clearly, I think that the Prime Minister at this juncture believes that he needs to stand up. He needs to stand up to the pressure, also because he doesn't want to embarrass. He doesn't want to embarrass Speaker Boehner and really risk a real crisis with the Republican supporters in both houses, and that would generate a force multiplier in terms of of a crisis with the United States. Number one, but number two, on the other hand, having said that, there are many pressures that we don't know of on this call, and the effect, the intensification of those political pressures can be so great. They can come from many different directions, and threats against Israel, diplomatic threats, can be so great that he might be forced to cancel. As you know, yesterday there were reports, mixed reports, and conflicting reports coming out of Israel that he was going to turn back and not deliver the speech, but those were confirmed to be not true in the end. But that's not to say that there are all sorts of pressures being mobilized right now against him from many different quarters that might try to force a cancellation. And if there was a postponement of the speech in Congress, I think that every person in the House will be watching the AIPAC speech anyway. So
that's right, and he will be at AIPAC. And isn't it possible that he could in some way have more private meetings with the Republicans and Democrats that will want to see him? But I'd like to get to Jerry Gordon, who's the senior editor of the New English Review, his question. And he asked, why has the reaction of mainstream Jewish organizations in the U.S. been so adverse to Bibi's speech?
Well, look, as a former senior employee of the World Jewish Congress said, there is clearly an ongoing, given bilateral tension between relationships and support for whatever current administration is in power in the United States, and support for the state of Israel. And this tension, this rope of tension has really been withering away. And I think that many mainstream, the most powerful and important Jewish organizations feel that they have to balance their interests between both sides of the ocean. And it's very disappointing when you look at it from an Israeli point of view. You don't have to be an Israeli to look at it from an Israeli point of view. You can be on this call and look at it from an Israeli point of view. But when you look at it from that point of view, and you see that there is not unconditional support for the sitting prime minister's decision, if it forces a certain level of discomfort in Jewish organizations for that unconditional support, you begin to wonder, is this really an identity problem that major Jewish organizations are facing with their constituency, and especially with their major funders? And I would submit, as the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, that it is, and that there is a serious collective and individual identity challenges in terms of Jewish identity, identifying with Israel, especially at a time of unprecedented delegitimization and demonization, and attempted criminalization of the Jewish state, that Jewish leaders have to put up with it. And in all fairness, you folks are out on the front line there in terms of the delegitimization of Israel, and Israel's on a different front line, certainly geographically, but one has to be very sensitive to that war that you folks are encountering. Having said that, I've always believed that Israel has to play a very, very strong role in reaching out every single day to Jewish organizations and making the case before Jewish leadership as to what existential and other strategic difficulties and dilemmas Israel faces. And that is Israel's responsibility. That's what we tried to do, by the way, Jerry, for the Global Coalition for Israel, which the World Jewish Congress at that time in 2010 created with the Israeli government. It was the first time ever that a major effort was undertaken to create that type of unity and fluid communication flowing from Israel out to the major Jewish organizations on a weekly basis. And I think that that's how to approach this type of identity issue and these types of political pressures that Jewish organizations are under constantly, from internal pressures as well as external pressures. So that's a short assessment to your question, which is very, very deep. It had very deep implications and ramifications, and it's something that we could spend a whole hour, if not much more, discussing just this question.
Next question. Helen Friedman, the Executive Director of Americans for State Israel, AFSI, notes that, as we know, many Democratic members of Congress have announced that they will boycott Bibi's talk. And will the absence of Democrats reveal their partisan nature? Is it something that American Jewish Democrats should be concerned about? How do you see their boycott of Bibi's speech playing out?
Well, first of all, it's clear, I think, to Helen and to everyone else that Democratic support for Israel has been waning in the last years, and it's now just under 50% in the last polls that we've seen. I think that that was pointed out in the Wall Street Journal editorial that I mentioned a little bit earlier, as to why, according to the editorial, Netanyahu should give the speeches. It is clear that the Democratic Party has a challenge with Israel, and we have a challenge with it. Notwithstanding, I think on the major issues, there has been there has been bipartisan support. At the same time, still 70% of American Jews voted for the Democratic Party in the last elections, in the re-election campaign of the president. And this is going to create, this has created some sort of movement of percentage-wise of, not unsubstantial percentages of Jews, American Jews, away from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party, and it may well continue to create this type of tension between the Democratic Party and Jewish Democrats and supporters of Israel, and that in order to bridge that gap, that's where Israel has to embrace American Jews of all stripes and make its case every single day. Because in that vacuum, if they don't, in that vacuum will seep in the detractors of Israel and the delegitimizers of Israel, and it will continue that vacuum between that gap, the chasm between the waning support of the Democratic Party as a whole and the support of of Jewish Democrats for the Democratic Party, and then hopefully continue for Israel. That gap will become larger and larger. So that's where Israel has to fill that gap constantly.
The next question is from Steve Goldberg in Los Angeles. Steve wants to know whether you believe that anyone actually believes that sanctions will deter Iran from its nuclear program, and he asked whether Netanyahu should be using his speech to prepare Congress, the American people, and even the Israeli people for the likelihood that Israel will need to take military action against Iran.
Well, first of all, sanctions were working against Iran. That's a great tragedy of this entire process was the demobilization of sanctions against Iran and the liberalization of parts of the Iranian economy, or the opening up of parts of the Iranian economy to outside economic inputs, and I absolutely think that this is the reason that Iran actually accepted the invitation to come and talk, because they were hurting, and the economy was self-destructing, and letting out that's exactly the argument that Israel was making over the last year and a half, that releasing Iran from these sanctions was a fatal mistake. And that's why the Kirk-Menendez legislation is so important, because on a bipartisan basis, Congress understood that reinstituting very strict, tough sanctions that the president has already threatened to veto, but those sanctions are the real lever that can bring Iran to halt its production. Let's remember, Iran only stopped its nuclear program. Its military nuclear program once, and that was in 2003, for a short while, right after the United States invasion of Iraq, because the Iranian regime felt that they were next online, and it was documented that they completely stopped enriching uranium, they stopped the weapons production, but after the halting and failed American administration of post-invasion Iraq, they began again, because they felt that the Americans weren't frankly tough enough in post-invasion Iraq, and they re-energized their program. Number one. Number two, I subscribe to John Bolton. John Bolton, former most senior State Department official on nuclear non-proliferation, as well as the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, said that the only thing standing between Iraq and nuclear weapons is a military operation at this point by the state of Israel. And I don't know whether it's the state of Israel that would have to take action, but someone's going to have to take action. I hope it would be the United States, led of the Western Alliance, as President Obama has stated time and time again. He said to Israel, "I've got your back, I've got your back." And the Iranians promised that the Iranians would not achieve nuclear weapons. And here we've got a deal that seems to prove exactly the opposite. So I do believe that, and many who are far more erudite than I am on this issue, believe that the only way, ultimately, of stopping the Iranians is the real viable threat of real military action.
Dan, Bob Kravitz from New York wants to know whether the Arab countries actually very quietly might have Israel's back.
Well, I think it's the opposite. I think Israel very quietly has the Arab world's back, and I can say that with great authority on this particular issue that there's never been a time in the last 80 or 90 years that the Sunni Arab establishment, we call them the moderates, but I use that word very, very cautiously and with great trepidation. I don't know, what is an Arab moderate? Someone that that is against beheading, or someone that's willing to talk to Israel. But the question is, how do they treat their own minorities? How do they treat women? And how do they treat religious minorities in their own countries? But having said that, the governments of Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, and Saudi Arabia have relationships with Israel today that are probably the best relationships quietly that Israel's had with them, and they with us. Those, as a matter of fact, it's been said at the highest levels of the security apparatus here in Israel that the relationship with Egypt today is of a strategic alliance, the nature of a strategic alliance, as opposed to the period of Mubarak, which was considered a government that was amenable to Israel. So there's been a tremendous strategic upgrade with Egypt, and Jordan has just returned its ambassador to Israel, and there's very close cooperation between Israel and those more amenable or moderate, quote-unquote, moderate Arab countries with regard to Iran. Those countries are crying every day about the Iranian nuclear threat to them. And they are turning to Israel and begging Israel to save them from the Iranian nuclear threat. And I am not exaggerating. I am not exaggerating. I've heard it myself.
A question from Stuart Ain. Do you believe that if Bibi is accompanied by Herzog, it would diffuse the political issue and make Bibi's speech just about Iran?
That's a very important question. It's something that has come up here, and it has been even mentioned as an option by Professor Eitan Gilboa, who arguably is probably the greatest expert in Israel on American-Israeli relations. There is this notion that if you want to talk about bipartisanship, quote unquote, that Israel could show certain bipartisanship by having Herzog and the Prime Minister join one another and share the stage in terms of underscoring the fact that this is the nuclear threat that has brought Israel to the United States to speak before Congress, and not anything political. Now, the other side of that discussion is that it is a very sensitive period all around, and it's sort of even though it would be a move that would cross any kind of political divide, because it's not a political issue. This is an issue of existence. But having said that, there are those that say, and I would say that I would support this position, that the sitting Prime Minister of Israel, who is arguably one of the greatest experts in the world on the Iranian threat of nuclear-backed terrorism, should be received as any other head of state who is a particular expert in this field should be received, and he should speak to the issue. And he was the one that was invited by the third most powerful person in the American governmental structure, and he should be able to make the case. I do accept the premise. I do accept, though, to agree, the underlying premise of Stuart's question. I think it should be discussed. And there are those that take a position on one side or the other. I think that the Prime Minister, it should be sufficient for him to be accepted to come to Congress and make the case on behalf of the Jewish people, and especially the Jewish state.
Dr. Ken Kellner in New York City makes a comment that isn't trying to silence Bibi, like trying to silence Churchill with regard to Hitler.
There are those that has come up frequently in the last 2 weeks. How long has this crisis been in motion? That this is the way Israel, much of Israel is looking at this as that you cannot silence. It's silencing the Jewish people on this issue. It's silencing the Jewish people in the Jewish state on an issue that is so fundamental to the national security to the survival of this country that it is tantamount to silencing Churchill. Churchill, of course, sacrificed his own political career to make his point to the Western Alliance. And in fact, I would suggest that Netanyahu is risking his own political career because even though he has support in Israel, certainly on all positions that have to do with national security, there's a strong position to say that there could be a real backlash politically against Netanyahu for arguably alienating or isolating Israel for whoever's responsible for it, and I don't believe that Israel's responsible for it. But the fact of the matter is that Israel, with regard to this administration, is far more isolated today than it has been before. Perhaps this has been one major isolation over the last 5 or 6 years, as many would argue that it's just an intensification of an isolation and a sort of a loneliness with this particular administration. But yes, I think he is arguably risking a political career, and I truly believe that he's doing it because of, they say in Hebrew, ha'inyan, because of the essence of the issue, not because of politics.
Actually, how do you think, without regard to the elections, if it's possible to disconnect what's going on right now, how is this issue hitting Israelis? And do they come out pro-Bibi or pro-Herzog on this issue?
It's a very difficult question because the polls, if you read the polls every day, you're going to get addicted to Dramamine because they just they've been swinging back and forth. There was a fairly cogent thesis until the beginning of this week, end of last week, beginning of this week, that the Likud had actually gained 5 to 6 mandates since the beginning of the crisis. They were down by 3 mandates to what's called the Zionist camp, and then they were up 3 mandates. So that's a net of 6 mandates, and the assessment of that result is that when it comes to issues of national security and even some sort of crisis opposite Barack Obama, that Netanyahu will always win out with his base and with a larger body politic in Israel that has moved pronouncedly to the right. I mean, you have an estimated 72 to 75 seats of the 120-seat Knesset that is identified as sort of a center-right, center edging to the right type of parties, including Kulanu under Kahlon, including even Yesh Atid is not considered a center-left party, but a center-center, even center-right party on certain issues like Jerusalem, so that really demonstrates that would have demonstrated that Netanyahu was the leader. However, there have been other polls that came out that are other polls that have come out recently, like the Haaretz poll that was done not by the editors of Haaretz but by Camille Fuchs, that showed that what was the Labor Party, that's now called the Zionist camp, was up by 3 to 4 mandates. So it's really been a swing here. And I think that the baseline assessment is that things are neck and neck between the two major parties, and so it's not clear what effect this has had. This crisis has had on the Israeli body politic, the public. The polls in Israel are uniquely difficult to embrace, because the issues are existential and they're very dramatic, and they can be shifted from moment to moment by a terror attack, by a rocket attack from Hezbollah in the north, the death of these soldiers. These cause swings of 2 and 3 and 4 mandates. Clearly, though, anything that any issue that focuses on national security, counterterrorism, defense, will play well towards Netanyahu. That will swing votes towards Netanyahu, clearly.
Dan, nobody wants to get off the phone. Could we have 2 more questions?
Sure.
Wonderful. One from Ron Palkey in New York. What are the implications for fallout between the U.S.-Israeli relationship if the P5-1 signs a deal with Iran and Israel then takes military action against Iran?
Well, those are a lot of ifs.
Yeah, I know, and that's everybody's worst nightmare.
Yeah, so there are an awful lot of ifs, and we really hope that we don't get to that to that point. But look, I think in Israel there's a very firm belief that the American people and the Israeli people, the Jewish people and the Israeli people, including those that are not Jewish but who do identify strongly with the state, are bound by Judeo-Christian tradition, bound by a moral tradition, bound by freedom, bound by democracy, and bound by a firm rejection of radical Islam and a fear of radical Islam. And that at the end of the day, that relationship from the ground up will form the bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood between the two nations. Clearly, the premise of the question is correct. I think the way I'm reading it, that there are a lot of bumps on the way. I mean, this is a very, very difficult time. I don't think that the tensions will subside in the near future. They may just only get worse, because when Israel's forced to take action, and it is being forced to take action on each of its borders all the time, and we are at war with Iran is at war with Israel right now. I think that point has to be made. Iran is at war with Israel. It is at war with Israel when it instructs the Hezbollah to fire, to fire into Israel, and those two soldiers were killed. We have reports even tonight that Hezbollah is basically sitting on the northern Golan Heights. That's Iran. Iran is funding and is funding, weaponizing, and supplying Hamas again in the south. And so there is a real concern that we are already at war with Iran, and the nuclear file is just another element in that particular war. So I think we have to make that case very clearly to the American people, because the Israelis know it. We knew it from this past summer. This last summer's war against Hamas was a real watershed moment, I think, for the Israeli public. They really understood that this game of conceding territory, of not standing up for yourself, of not fighting and pushing back against radical Islamic forces, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda, is simply a losing game. So every time that Israel is forced to take action to protect itself, it's going to face tremendous diplomatic pressure. Because it is my assessment the world does not like tough, plucky, strong Jews that know how to defend ourselves militarily. They just don't like that image for Jews. They like Jews as being more passive, Jews as advisors, not Jews as fighters. And that's the position that Israel's in all the time. And that's why the communication between us and the Jews in the diaspora all the time, constantly, in a fluid way, constant way, and the American people, who are our greatest friends in the world. No greater friends to the Jewish people, to the state of Israel, than the American people. And that's why those are our markets. Strengthen our base, and pray, and hope for the best.
Dan, I'm actually going to cut it off here. It is very late. It is 11 o'clock here in Israel. And I want to thank you for taking so much time for us this evening. And Sarah, thank you so much for moderating so beautifully and getting as many questions as we can. And I want to just two things to encourage everyone on this call to do and that is number one, to please go either to our Facebook, American Friends of Likud Facebook, and get the links for Dan Diker's interview with former Mayor Rudy Giuliani there, or to go to search for Voice of Israel and be able to see it there. And finally, to ask you all to please go to American Friends of Likud, that is to aflikud.org, and show your support so that we can continue to bring just excellent and incredibly insightful words and thoughts from people like our friend Dan Diker. Dan, thank you very, very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you ever so much to all of you.
Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it.
And good night. I hope you go to sleep.
And good night to everyone.
Good night to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.